This is the first time I've written a book, so this is the first time I'm signing anything other than a poster, which is really exciting. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Bette Gordon, for.
Is my mic on? I'll probably use it a little, but it's. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, and it's so amazing just to kind of revisit a world that really way back then. So I have a lot of questions about that, and I know you guys probably have questions too. So yeah, do you want to start with anything, or should I?
Well, we can start with how we kind of know each other and where.
The world.
The world we had in common, which really was. I mean, for me, I think Bette, you moved into downtown New York
a little bit later than you. Yeah.
So I moved there in it was around 1974, September 1973, actually, to go to NYU Film School. And I'm originally from the suburbs of Philadelphia, and I knew I wanted to. Oh, right. I knew I wanted to leave, and I think that NYU Film School sort of gave me the motivation to kind of come to New York. I had originally been. I thought I wanted to be a fashion designer. And then I realized that I wanted the fashions to move, and I wanted to put music to them, and I also wanted them to tell stories, and you can probably see that influence in the films I've made. And that brought me to NYU. And it was a very interesting time, a little bit, because the 70s, 1974, 75, 76, New York was still pretty rough. We were still in the middle of a bankruptcy crisis, and the good news is that students and aspiring artists could afford to live in the city, which was great. And the other good news was because it was falling apart, it was so chaotic, you kind of felt it was almost like an outlaw territory, felt the Wild West in some ways. And it was sort of a creative playground for a lot of people who came there around the same time. And not just for film, but for the arts, the East Village art scene at that time, the music scene, the graffiti art, and all these things kind of cross-pollinated. And I think certainly had an effect on my work, and I think also on your work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it's so great, when I look back to that time period, and we've talked about it, and it's when I go to other places, other cities, other countries, everybody, even here too, everybody says, well, tell us about the late 1970s and the 1980s. I don't know how many of you guys were around then, but it has a kind of legacy, right? And so the word downtown, in and of itself, from generations before us, but certainly our time at that moment, it somehow encapsulated a very special moment in this period of filmmaking, a time in which Susan made two of the most important films that defined that time period, and Jim Jarmusch made Stranger Than Paradise, I Mean Variety, Scott and Beth B made some great B movies, Vivian Dick made She Had Her Gun Already. There's so much, and then we had our friends who, of course, the scene was located, and it's interesting that Susan titles every chapter the name of a song, but music really was the foundation for, and you see it in her work, it was the foundation for everything. It sort of revolved around Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine when you think about television and CBGBs, which was, and you were living there before I was in the Lower East Side. So that's like, and you guys know it probably, but it would be so fun just give us a little bit of that time in your life and how fun and crazy it was.
I think the thing that I responded to the most, in a way, was the fact that it was almost, for me, it was almost like Judy Garland and
No,
what's his Rooney,
Oh,
Mickey
yeah,
Rooney,
yeah.
like putting on a show in their garage. I mean, it was very uncalculated and very, in some ways, unprofessional, but in the good sense of unprofessional. I don't think we were making movies. I know when I started out, I wasn't thinking about, oh, how am I going to get this to a film festival, or how am I going to get an agent? I was just wanted to tell stories about the characters that I knew and the feel of those times. And I think that kind of innocence, you can feel it in all of our films, I think.
And you and I talked about this once. I was asked to give a talk in Belgium, and I called Susan and said, what was so astonishing about this time? And it was Lizzie, Susan, and me, and we all said the same thing. We said, we didn't know what we didn't know, and it was so liberating. And the main thing we didn't know about were marketplace and what characterized your first two films. And you kind of, after that, you were like queen. Like we would say, where's Susan? What is she doing? But what characterized our films was this freedom and lack of marketplace. That was the time. We didn't even know the word that every 13-year-old girl knows now: agent, manager, brand, influencer. It was so freeing, and we were so lucky that the marketplace didn't care about us, and we even more strongly didn't care about it. We made films because it was fun, and we made films for each other. Don't you think?
I mean, for me, and perhaps this applies to variety as well. I mean, I also had a thing, because I think I was also influenced when I was in college by feminism. It was the early 70s, and second wave feminism was suddenly really important and influential. And one of the things I realized coming out of that was that as a woman who wanted to make movies, the chances of me going to Los Angeles, I could go there, knock on doors till my fists were bloody, and probably no one would hire me. I mean, I kind of intuitively knew that, and felt that if I was going to make a movie, I would have to at least hire myself. I was the only one that was going to hire me when I was starting out. I think the other thing was that I felt in the 70s, and I love the grittiness of 70s movies, New York 70s movies, like French Connection and, all the great Scorsese's, Mean Streets, and was that they were also very macho. And that was great because there were male directors making those movies. But the women were kind of boring in the 70s. There was a lot of buddy. Well, that buddy stuff is really the 80s. But in the 70s, it was the women were basically the girlfriends, the wives. They were in the kitchen or in bed. But they weren't that interesting. And whereas the male characters, when you think about Midnight Cowboy, Ratso Rizzo, or you think about every early movie that Jack Nicholson ever made, they were complicated characters, and they weren't necessarily nice. They were just interesting. So for me, that became one of the things that I wanted to make interesting female characters, and I didn't really care whether they were nice in a traditional way. I remember reading some early reviews of Smithereens where some of the critics criticized the fact that the character Red was unsympathetic. I know, but I like her. And it wasn't my goal to make a sympathetic character. It was, I just wanted to be an active character. So I don't know if you felt the same way in terms of variety, or
probably not. I think sort of coming to it a little bit later. For me, I was an avant-garde filmmaker before, so I was always interested in the film form itself, so I kind of, like, we got to the same place, but we came there differently, which is so fabulous and beautiful. And I remember talking to Lizzie, and she was really into sort of the Guerrilla Girls, and like even yet that the fact is that so many people had such different backgrounds at that time, and yet we all sort of came together. Yeah. But I love the 70s that you're talking about, because it really represented also the best of Hollywood, with Easy Rider and Bob Rafelson, 5 Easy Pieces. So in that spirit, that finding the female version of that is really
kind of female anti-hero.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
that's how I saw Ren in a way.
Yeah.
And I think also for me, because New York did change a little bit in the 3 years. Well, weirdly enough, I started Smithereens in 1980. It took me 2 years to actually film it.
Will you talk a little bit about NYU at that time? It's very, sort of more, it sounded really great and funky.
Well, NYU was very funky back then. It was even located in a funky building. It was on 7th Street and 2nd Avenue, and we shared the building with the Fillmore East.
Yes.
Yeah.
So could you hear music blasting while you were in the editing room?
If you were there at night, maybe.
Yeah.
All night. But it was also the East Village was changing, because it had been kind of, the counterculture had been hippie counterculture in the 60s and early 70s. And when I got there in the mid 70s, you could feel the vibe changing. Suddenly, the rainbows and sunshine was fading a little bit, and something different, something edgier was coming in. And especially, around St. Mark's Place, which was kind of ground zero in some ways, certainly in terms of, the record shops and the clothing stores and the,
bookstores. St. Mark's.
Yes, absolutely. And movie theaters, the St. Mark's Theater at the time. But, so NYU kind of prided itself as almost being anti-LA in its point of view. I mean, everyone in my class, when I was at NYU, there were 35 people in the class. It was 30 men, 5 women, and all the guys wanted to make their version of a Godard movie. Which, again, we were kind of looking more towards Europe and European cinema, and not towards LA at that time. The other thing for me, and I don't know if you ever felt that, because I didn't really have a female role model as a I was always looking kind of for a woman that I could, who was making movies, an American movie. I know that, an American woman director. There were a lot more in Europe.
Right, and you found one.
Well, the person that inspired me actually was a film director named Lena Wertmuller, who in the mid-70s made 3 very powerful films right in a row. And what was great about the films was that they were bold and they were colorful. And even though the main character often was a man, well, there was a man and a woman, but Giancarlo Giannini, I think his name was. You could feel the director's female sensibility kind of overlaid on those films. And to me, that was incredibly inspiring, because interestingly enough, when I was growing up until film school, when I got to see European women directors, the only woman director I had ever heard of, except for the actress, Ida Lupino.
Yes.
And I never saw her.
Dorothy Arzner.
We didn't know about
her. No, nobody
now
did.
I know of them.
It was that moment in time with women sort of going back in history and saying, hey, how come there are no women directors in the history books? And now unearthed, so many women who worked in the industry before the industry was commercial, when it was still kind of an art form in the 1920s.
Well, when it was silent, and then when the studios realized that movies could talk and they could make a lot of money, suddenly all those great silent female film directors disappeared.
Yeah.
But besides Ida Lupino, who I knew was an actress and I'd seen maybe on TV some of her films, the only woman I ever paid money to go to see her movie was Mike Nichols, Elaine May.
Yeah.
That was the only person I could think of. So for me, it was really important when I started to make films to work with other women, support other women, and make films that had strong, feisty, female characters that could also be outsiders and good and bad girls.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's interesting, because I talk a little bit about the avant-garde where I came from, but there were more women working, of course, in the sort of, underground. And for me, one of the women I met when I was a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison with Reed was Shirley Clark. Now, I don't know if you guys know Shirley Clark. She was part of a sort of generation of Robert Frank and Allen Ginsberg, like that whole sort of pre-generation. And I met her once, and she was like the toughest woman. Portrait of Jason, The Connection. She was very much a part also of Jonas and of course, the Anthology Film Archive, which was the standard for the avant-garde world. But there was so many small little places because, exactly for what you say, we didn't have role models, except in the sort of outer banks of things, and in the mainstream, sorely absent, and that was about to change as you move forward.
Yeah.
So that's pretty.
Because the other thing I wanted to talk about is, in my career, I do ride the line between being an indie filmmaker and making studio movies. And working in television, and I kind of like doing all those things. But I also knew that the transition from being an independent filmmaker to then making a studio movie was tricky. I'm not going to name names, but I knew of a woman who had made a wonderful low-budget indie film, then did her first studio movie, and had a heavy-handed producer. And the movie did not perform at the box office, and then she disappeared for many, many, many years. And I loved making movies and didn't want to just disappear. So that transition from going from indie to studio was really important for me, that I made sure I picked the right script, and also that I picked the right creative partners. And I lucked out by finding two women, Mitch Sanford and Sarah Pillsbury, and brought me a screenplay, Desperately Seeking Susan, that just happened to have my name in it. That was written by Leora Barish. And the funny thing about that is that they had not made a movie before. I had. So I was the experienced one, and so I didn't feel that kind of, experienced producer, heavy-handed producer looking over my shoulder.
Right. And that power team, though, because I've met those two women. They were so amazing. So really, the three of you together kind of plowed forward.
Well, the script had been around for a little while before it came to me, and they had hoped to find a female producer, a director, but there weren't too many of us around. So I think they had originally taken it to people like Jonathan Demme, the director, and I heard also Louis Malle was somebody else that they had shown that script to, and it would have been a very different movie. They could have done a great version of that, but it would have been a very different movie.
And finally, Jonathan did make a movie like that called Something Wild, in a way, like you made it first.
And I could have made it with Melanie Griffith.
Oh, really?
But he did.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Melanie was one of the people who could have been the Susan character.
Yes.
In Desperately Seeking Susan. But again, what I realized that it was really important to just surround yourself with the right people.
sure, yeah. And also, in the spirit that just sort of what you had already done was, it was, everybody was sort of working you were working with friends. Like, I guess the point is that you understood that it wasn't, you didn't need professionalism in that sense. I mean, you were working with your friends and fellow students, so you guys just did it. It's that self-empowerment. And I worry a little bit about today. I mean, I don't mean to jump in, so I want to stay here, but I worry about this feeling that you can't do anything until you have A, B, C, D, like lining everything up and having, people already, giving you, it's about permission. You never asked permission, you just did it. Same with me. And I think that served you as a filmmaker, even when you were in Hollywood. I mean, you just went straight.
Yeah. Although I probably nowadays, I mean, because let's face it, the movie business has changed dramatically. So many of the movie chains have gone out of business. The studios, I've said this before, when I look back at old Hollywood, and there were, a lot of sharks and, a lot of sharks swimming around there. But they liked movies. If you think about Louis B. Mayer or Samuel Goldwyn, I mean, maybe some of, they might have been a little crude, but they liked movies. And today, what I find confusing is, I don't know who's running things. It's sort of like Comcast. I don't know who Comcast is or what their point of view is. What kind of movies they want to make. And but what is, I guess, interesting is because of the internet, and because I know a friend of mine's daughter is a sort of TikTok superstar. She just does these little videos of herself, and she has like 70 million followers, and she has created a character that people relate to and love. So in a way, she's doing with her little iPhone what I was doing.
Yes.
Running around the East Village.
Right, running around the East Village and creating something that could be projected on a screen. Like that feeling, I think, is something that we know, and there's probably nothing more powerful when you see your film with an audience for the first time.
Yeah.
And Smithereens broke all records. Not only did it get invited to Cannes, which for us was sort of the dream of like, oh my God, but also it went from the director's fortnight, which was so important for us, but to the competition. And have there been anything like that?
No, Smithereens was the first indie American film to be in the competition in Cannes. And what was so cool about that, again, back to this sort of naivete, this ignorance is bliss. I had heard about the Cannes Film Festival, but I didn't know what a big deal it was, and I didn't know it would actually change my life in many ways. But I showed up there with the lead actress, Susan Berman, and we were like two little waifs. There we were kind of walking up the red carpet and looking around, and there was all this craziness, because it really is, especially back then, it was a wild zoo. Very glamorous, very decadent, and very weird. But there was something wonderful. I think we both sort of felt like, Alice in Wonderland, like we had dropped down this rabbit hole and found ourselves in this wacky world.
Yes. And after that, you said, okay, so was that the change? That really was the moment. I wonder, when people think, if this hadn't happened, then like the rest of my life, I'm sure everybody has moments like that, but really this was big. So after that, you traveled around with the film, and you had sort of established yourself, and that's when you said you went out to LA and really basically made the deal for Desperately
Well,
Seeking.
I went out to, I got an agent when I was at the Cannes Film Festival who sent me dozens and dozens and dozens of really stupid studio projects. One of them I remember was called The Joy of Sex. Another female director ended up doing it and regretted doing it. I mean, she had a bad experience. But it was a popular book title at the time. that had no script. I mean, there was no story. The studio just bought this book title because they thought it was catchy. And that was thankfully one I turned down. But it did take me about, I read, I don't know, 50 to 100 bad scripts, knowing that I needed to be smart about what I wanted to do next until I got Desperately Seeking Susan.
And so that was the next moment, and so now
And
you get to come back to New York.
And I get to come back to New York, and I think what was interesting for me about that was that having been a girl who came from the suburbs, but also now being somebody, at that time, still being somebody who lived in the, downtown Manhattan, the store, and also somebody who, like the character of Rosetta Arquette in the movie, I wanted to reinvent myself, like everyone, now and forever, who comes to Manhattan from someplace else, maybe feeling a little bit like an outsider where they came from, but who desperately wants to be somebody different. I related to both those characters, so I felt very comfortable doing those films because I knew both those worlds. Doing that film, I knew both the worlds, and I knew who both the leading ladies were. And it was also nice because I got to work with some really talented collaborators. The DP was a guy named Ed Lockman. I think this was his first sort of studio movie. He had done some European films.
I think he was the vendor's guy too.
He did, and Herzog, I think he moved down. But this was his first studio movie, so he wasn't a typical union cinematographer. He had another kind of, he was a painter. He painted with light. So that was kind of wonderful. And then I also got to work with Santo Loquasto, who had done and went on to do many more Woody Allen movies in his good period, the 80s. And Santo was both the production designer and the costume designer. And what was great about that was there was a unified visual palette there. And the reason that happened actually was out of necessity. I think our movie was relatively low budget for a studio movie, so they figured rather than hiring and paying two people, they'd pay him a little bit more, he'd do both jobs. But artistically, it made a lot of sense. I should point out, we also had a fantastic publicist. I had a fantastic publicist for both my first three movies. We both
It's essential. Without your publicist, nobody knows, really who you are yet.
Yeah.
So that was great.
Yeah.
All right, tell us, obviously you're doing the book, and it's just such a joy to read the whole book, but, especially these chapters as you see the development and casting Madonna. Do you have any, sort of just as an actress, she was already a character, and she was already on the verge of becoming even bigger than she was at the very moment. Tell us just, I don't know, any story just about her work as an actress.
Yeah. Well, what I can say is I had such a good experience working with a non-actor like Richard Hell in Smithereens, and I saw my job as the director was to kind of take what I thought was interesting about his persona, what I thought was interesting about him as a person, and try to get that onto the celluloid. And so when we were casting for the role of Susan, there were a lot of, this was 1984 when we were doing the casting, a lot of the young up-and-coming actresses at the time came into audition. Melanie Griffith, Ellen Barkin, Linda Fiorentino, Jamie Lee Curtis, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Kelly McGillis came when we were filming. I forget what part we were filming in. There were only about 6 of us doing the filming. And no one was paying attention. They probably thought we were an NYU film crew or whatever. Madonna wasn't a star, so they weren't even looking at her. Except for a bunch of young teenagers that walked by and looked and said, "Oh, there's Cyndi Lauper." But really, it was quite fascinating because, as Reed knows, when we started filming, the very first shot we filmed was on St. Mark's Street. You know the film is the shot where she's eating Cheetos, wearing those little white gloves, and when we were filming there, there were trucks and there were lights and cameras, but there weren't a lot of people. New Yorkers are cool, so they kind of looked, we're making a movie. I don't remember a big hubbub, but by the time we finished the movie, 9 weeks later, her Like a Virgin album had exploded, and we needed security to kind of keep people away. And it had her career had skyrocketed that quickly in such a short period of time, and I'd never seen anything like that before. And just one little anecdote, and which is that normally a film has you spend about 5, sometimes 6 months in pre-production after you're done filming to do the editing, the sound mix, all the stuff you need to do. Orion, our studio, had the editor and myself rush the post-production because they were afraid Madonna her career wouldn't last more than a couple of months, and they wanted the film to come out in time to capitalize on that.
I love the sort of miscalculation of executives in an industry that they control but just don't get it, and it's just beautiful. So history is made, and of course you get to go back to Cannes again, now season. Yeah. And I can imagine, that this time was a little different than before because you had done it, and the film was a huge success, and you garner, so much energy, and really the film is top of the charts, and so important in a way, it also generates more.
I'm not sure I thought I was a filmmaker. I'd be interested to ask you. I wanted to be a filmmaker. I was making movies, but somebody after or around the time I was making Smithereens, and even after the Cannes Film Festival, somebody said, "What do you do? What is your profession?" Like you go through customs and it says profession.
I love that.
I'm not sure I would have written down film director. I don't remember what I would have written down during my Smithereens days. Maybe still student, or I don't know what I would have. But definitely after Desperately Seeking Susan, I felt I could write down film director with confidence on that that little form.
Yeah. That's so cool.
But a general note, one of the things I wanted to say is that for me, it has always been interesting to either work with actors in unexpected ways, or to take a genre and twist it in an unexpected way. For example, I got to work with Meryl Streep on a movie called She-Devil. She had never done a comedy before. After She-Devil, she went on to do many more. But at the time, she had never made a comedy before, and I thought she's such a talented actress. And I had heard she'd done some comedy theater stuff when she was at Yale. But, and she's so smart, she's so skilled, and for comedy, you really need great skill and timing. I thought, wouldn't it be great to kind of ask Meryl Streep to be in a comedy? And fortunately, we met, and she liked the role. She was eager to do that. But again, because
you had the foresight to see that and to know that, right?
Well, I just had this hunch that she would be good in a comedy. It would be fun to work with her. When I think I heard that when she was first given the script, thought she was playing the Roseanne Barr character.
Oh my God! Yeah, that is crazy. Yeah. But because you're talking about genre and character, one of the things that you do always talk about is your love, of course, of character, but screwball comedy. And screwball comedy as a genre, I'm sure you know how we describe that as a kind of genre that explores really given to female characters who sort of turn the tables without other people realizing it. A powerful genre for women. And you talk about both French and American. Is there any particular? It's Girl Friday, of course.
Well, I always liked the Lady Eve.
The Lady
It's
Eve,
Preston Sturges movie, The Lady Eve, because again, I liked that she was smart, she was sassy, she was sexy, and she could hold her own and actually trick the leading man. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what I liked about the screwball comedies from the late 30s and early 40s, is because the women were so strong and smart, and they could be manipulative, they could be nice, but they had that combination of characters. But then what happened? And I kind of read up on this. I never thought about it before I started working on this book. World War II came along. And after World War II, when the men came home, they started making a lot of patriotic movies. And if you look at like in the 1950s, the women went back to the bedroom, back to the kitchen, except for the bad girls, and they went to prison. So you have all those women in prison movies.
Yes. One of the best women in prison movies ever is Jonathan Demme again, a film called Caged Heat.
Yeah.
You know, that is amazing. So he was, I mean, we keep mentioning him a lot, and we're very sad that we've lost him, and he's a friend of both of ours. And but he also, like you, had that ability to sort of take a genre and turn it on its head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He did. I'm going to say one thing about him because he's a wonderful filmmaker. He was also a pretty wonderful person. I think when you talk to a lot of independent filmmakers, especially, New York filmmakers of my generation, of our generation, he was very helpful to them starting out in terms of advice, sometimes even help with financing. I know he helped Nancy Savoca get
The Household Saints.
No,
the one
the wedding.
before that.
The bridal movie.
the wedding movie.
With Annabella Secor.
Yeah. But he was very helpful. And one of the things he did for me was he turned me on to the Feelies, who did the soundtrack for Smithereens. Actually, first he turned me on to John Cale. And it was not a good time in John Cale's life. It was, we met and I knew that this was not going to be a good working relationship. But then he turned me on to the Feelies. And the weird thing with them is that their music so fit the energy of the main character of Smithereens that usually you kind of cut the film and then you bring in a musician or that scores to the picture. I kind of did it the other way around. I liked their music so much. I recut sequences of the film to fit their existing music.
It makes sense. Yeah. So tied together. I mean, in that period too, it was that relationship, as I said before, of music and film were so. I mean, are still, but in the way that you describe, even more so in that time. Do you think making Mr. Right, which was the film that Susan made after, really right after, Desperately, not right after, but soon after, No, it's a little screwball-y.
Making Mr. Right is definitely a screwball comedy.
And I don't know if you got to see that, but also another casting, amazing choice of, a lot. You talk about the casting,
Again, that idea, the movie Making Mr. Right starts John Malkovich playing two characters into a role, and Anne Magnuson. And again, along the lines of Richard Hill and Madonna and Magnuson, she was kind of a downtown
performance artist.
She was a performance artist. She used to run a club called Club 57. That was this very cool club. And was sort of friendly with like Kenny Sharp and Keith Haring, because they all used to hang out in Club 57 at that time. But she wasn't really, if you know Desperately Seeking Susan. She was the cigarette girl in that one.
Yeah, perfect.
I liked her, and I thought that she had something special about her, and so I guess with the clout that I had from Desperately Seeking Susan, I was able to convince the studio to let me make a movie with
She really
unproven-
wasn't. Yeah, she wasn't known as an actor or
Yeah.
actress,
Yeah.
but she had the personality, and you just
Yeah.
seemed to find it. And
But that was very much inspired by like His Gal Friday,
Yes.
those kinds of Rosalind Russell
love
kinds
those.
of characters.
And was Malkovich? What did he? He was, of course, famous for Steppenwolf in theater. Had he done? What had he done?
He had done one movie that I knew about was called Places in the Heart, and he was great in it, and I think he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor role. But it was a very serious part.
Right.
But again, that thing about picking your collaborators. I mean, if any of you work, I don't know, I'd be curious to know if any of you were filmmakers or, because it is collaborative. So you have to make sure you and your partners are on the same page. And I worked with him because I thought he was a wonderful actor, but also he was a director, a theater director. So I thought that would be great. And that
Was
would be a
it?
good
Did
collaborator.
you feel that sense of the
I
director?
just thought he was smart and he
Yeah.
knew the needs of a director.
Right. That's
So he wasn't gonna, I could have a conversation with him that wasn't just actor talk. It was also about the needs
So
of
you
the
had like the
film.
shorthand of that
Yeah.
too. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. And Making Mr. Right really kind of soared again. I mean, it had such a novel idea.
It's weird because the film when it came, okay, be straightforward. I was kind of nervous after making Desperately Seeking Susan because I kind of figured whatever I do next, that was such a surprise success and such a much bigger success than I expected, that I kind of was waiting for the curtain to drop, and I kind of felt like it would be hard to,
What do you do next?
I
How do you
didn't know
beat
what to
that?
do next. Interesting. So the film did not do well in the box office, and I was nervous that I would totally disappear. But interestingly enough, what's happened recently with that film is there's kind of been a resurgence of people being interested in it. It disappeared for 30 years, and it's very sad when you make something and then you're not in control of it, the studio owns it, you can't tell them to put it on TV or release a new DVD or stream it or whatever. You have no control. That's the bad thing about the studio movie. But suddenly, and maybe it's because of, it's looked at differently through today's eyes, and also our current interest in AI. And this is a movie about a woman who falls in love with an android. And so it's a AI human love story. That suddenly it's getting
And even
comeback.
visually, it somehow feels like, from what I remember having seen it, that it fits in the moment. The colors were bright.
I think people get the aesthetic of that. What
Yes.
I wanted to do with Making Mr. Right was to make a retro, futuristic movie, which is kind of a weird combination. It's about an android, so it's the future, but I wanted it to look retro. I wanted it to look kind of mid-century.
Like Technicolor or something.
Absolutely Technicolor.
Yeah.
So that was a combination that some people got. David Byrne got it. But not everyone. You had to kind of be on that wavelength.
Yeah.
But I think that people now can look at it differently.
You know what? I'm just listening to you, and I'm like jumping way ahead.
I'll say because of Sopranos and Sex and the City. And I was sent the pilot script by a guy named Darren Starr, who was the writer, executive producer. And you never know whether something's going to be a success or become iconic. You just don't know. You just know whether you like it or not. And I read the script and I thought it was really bold. And I liked that it had that it's about female friendship.
Yeah.
and that it sort of tried to capture the way women can talk around each other, with each other.
Support each other, fight with each other,
Yeah.
live in the world with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was about New York, and it's about the city. And so I think it's interesting because I was just involved in the first season of Sex and the City. But if you look at that season and then compare it with season 6, it's very different. It was much grittier the first season. There were also, the Karen character looks a little different. She looks more like a real writer. The clothing is a little funkier. Everything's just a little grittier, and then it evolved into what it evolved into, and you can't, it was a huge success. So
it got commercial, but
well, maybe, you can't argue with success.
No,
but
exactly.
I know that when I worked on it, when I did the pilot. If you look at that, it was definitely more like, I felt like I was making a little film, not a TV series. In fact, the person that I worked with, the two people that, you're often the biggest collaborators are your cinematographer and your production designer. The cinematographer of the pilot was a guy named Stuart Driver, who worked with Jane Campion and did the piano.
oh my God.
So he was not a TV guy, he was a movie
Right.
guy, and the production designer, I'm going to mess up his last name, Mark Fearberg,
Yes. Yeah.
who did the Mira Nair movies.
Yes.
So we were definitely trying to put together a little 30-minute movie.
Getting on the red carpet had to be.
Well, that was one of the highest ones, and then there were low moments
Yeah.
too. I've had in my career really good timing, like I could have never predicted that Madonna was going to become a superstar. I couldn't have predicted Sex and the City would become an iconic TV show. But I made a movie which I loved making called Galby Afternoon with a great cast: Jim Davis, Marcia Gay Clark, Juliette Lewis, Lily Taylor. And it came out right after. It was supposed to come out right after 9/11. And it was with a Spanish production company. It just disappeared. And then for many years, long story short, they put it out in a bad version of a DVD, a bad VHS DVD. And then the company went bankrupt in Spain, and so for like 20 years, I couldn't find a producer. And I had no idea, how. Finally, so he sold his company to another company. It's like a detective. I had to track down who owned the rights.
And you did.
Finally did. And now what? And now they have it. I think it may, if not now, soon be available for streaming.
Wait. Yeah.
But when you make something and it disappears for 20 years, I asked about if there was any filmmakers here, is that one of the things that I hope you like the book. I've never done this before, I've never written one before, but one of the things I wanted to do was kind of write a book that I wish I could have read when I was starting out, because there really wasn't a book like that I was aware of. So, it is about to kind of just tell it like it is from my point of view, that in the hopes that other people will relate to the ups and the downs and everything in between. And anyway, I hope you will. I think it's because the theme worked. I think a lot of people, it's about a woman. I always looked at it as sort of a female love story, but without the sex, in a way. It's about female, and it may be true with men looking up to their heroes. I think women often look at somebody else, maybe another woman, and go, I wonder what her life is like, or I wonder if I could be like her. At least I used to, when I was young. There's people we kind of admire for whatever reasons, and that kind of infatuation, and that desire to transform yourself. I think that theme is what pulled the chemistry, made the chemistry work. Because if you look and analyze that film, they have very few scenes together. They're barely in the film together. The only time that you see them together is when one is, Rosanna Arquette is following after Susan, kind of curious to find out where she's going. So the chemistry is built into the situation. It really wasn't about the acting between the two women, as much as the desire for one to be the other. And then when Madonna goes to Rosanna's house, her desire to just sort of feel like what would we like to live in this kind of house with a hot tub. But I think it's about the theme that made that work.
That's fair, it was, as I described those days, I was walking down the street in the Lower East Side. My boyfriend lived in the corner of 7th Street and Avenue C, and Luis was from the neighborhood. And in those days, it was, and I think probably true with Smithereens. So a friend of mine, Emily, in his building said, "Oh, do you know Luis? He has a little theater called Charas on the 9th Street. It was a Puerto Rican theater. And hey, hi." And I said, "Oh my God." I said, "Hi, Luis, I love your face." I said, "Would you be in my movie?" He goes, "Yeah, sure." I said, "Well, you play like the guy standing at the door of a porn movie." He said, "Fine, great." I said, "Well, I could pay you $25 a day." "Fine, I don't care." If I went to Luis today, he'd say, "I'd love to do it, call my agent." So it was just that sense of finding somebody, and it was that sense I had of, I need this face. That's it, face is face. And he lived up to every moment of it, and we're still really close friends. And I put him in one or two other things when I worked for Laurel Entertainment, and I did these like weird Tales of the Dark Side movies and stuff like that for TV. But he does give that same performance. It's that element of what Susan talks about is finding the thing in the person that you see in the character, and it makes life really easier than not finding it and trying to like create it when it's not there. So, and what about
Well, I'll just mention something about Peter Falk, and that is that he was the male lead, the movie called Cookie with Peter Falk and Emily Lloyd and Diane Reist and Jerry Lewis.
pretty amazing?
It's interesting. He was very much a kind of method. I could see why he and Cassavetes would really click. And I can remember, in between takes, seeing him, and he would be practicing his lines and his hand gestures, and he'd be kind of in his own weird world. And he's very much, there's something, Columbo-ish about him in real life. But in the same sense that you kind of think he's kind of a little eccentric and spacey and scattered, then he's really sharp, that was an interesting movie to work on because, we're talking about the good, the bad, and everything else. It was a movie that had been made by one studio, financed by one studio. That studio then was sold to Warner Brothers. It was a studio called Lorimar that was big for a little while in the 80s, in the 80s. But sometimes what happens in that system is when a studio gets bought by another studio, the films, at least my film, it felt like an orphan. Suddenly no one was watching out for it. So it the Warner's people hadn't developed it. They had no invested interest in this film. And so it kind of got lost in the shuffle, and it sat on the shelf for about a year and a half. And what happened during, Cookie's a mafia comedy. Again, a twist on the mafia genre because it's a father-daughter mafia movie. What happened during that year and a half while it was finished and just sitting there was suddenly a couple other mafia comedies came out, like Married to the Mob, and there were a couple of them. And so suddenly cookie wasn't as fresh a cookie as it had been 2 years earlier when I had made it. And that's, again, one of those things that's just, you can't predict just a time. No, I went to dinner with him a few times, and he's eccentric.
Yeah.
In a wonderful way, he's eccentric, but also really laser sharp when he wants to be. But I do have a funny story, and I'm going to ruin it because it was, I tell it in the book, but I'll tell it here. And then that was working with Jerry Lewis, who was also in the movie. He was legendary,
And beloved by the French.
beloved by the French. As a director, he invented video assist. When you look and you watch, that didn't exist before Jerry Lewis invented the video assist, which is kind of an interesting point. But so we were filming a section of the scene down in Atlantic City, and he was in this trailer, and I went in. I hadn't met him before he came. First day on the set, I walk into his trailer. He was there with his wife, and they had a couple little dogs. And he is a bit of he's a legendary control freak, and he was then as well, because he wouldn't let the wardrobe person pick his wardrobe out, and he wouldn't let the makeup person do his makeup. He did it himself. And back in the older days, when it was shot on sound stages in the studio, they used to use a kind of makeup like a Max Factor makeup that was very thick and very artificial because the lights were so strong. So if you saw somebody, it looked like they were wearing almost like a clown. They had very heavy, thick makeup. And I walked in and he had this bright orange pancake face. And I thought, again, we were shooting it was a daylight scene, more naturalistic lighting, and I was really nervous because how could I say, "Hi, I'm Susan, the director. Can you please wash your face?" I couldn't. I just was nervous, so I thought, what to do? So I decided to keep my mouth shut, see how the first day of rushes, Downey's would look. Very worried that, well, actually, he did look a little like President Trump. He was also playing or former President Trump. He was playing a real estate developer in the movie. So I watched the first day of Downey's, and I was shocked. He looked like a guy with a suntan. He just looked like it looked like a real suntan. And I was very happy that I had not opened my mouth and started our relationship off on the wrong foot.
Smart. Yeah, that's great.
Well, I can tell my husband you can talk about the feminist messaging. But I think that the movie business is so weird right now in terms of the big movies. I mean, I have great respect for for Greta Gerwig and the ability to make a movie that made $1 billion, play in that, on that level and show she can do it. I think it's absolutely amazing. And to make a movie that the Barbie lovers and Barbie haters could both like, I think is also fascinating. But I think where women are really showing their strength is in television.
Right, because you're giving so many people their first chance. And
Everyone hear you?
Yeah, I was thinking.
there are so many people getting their first chance on the movie. The casting directors were Risa Bramon and Billy Hopkins, who became the biggest casting directors, but they had never done the job ever before, and they were finding all these people, and I know you were, like all the people in downtown were put into it, and people like Shirley Stoller and all these interesting people, and people like John Turturro. He was very early on, maybe, but it was a lot of Ann Magnuson's in that film, and you just in that Magic Club, there were so many people in there who would later become Tom DiCillo, who became a director, was in
And a
the Magic Club.
cinematographer, yeah.
What?
And cinematographer.
He was the cinematographer from Stranger Than Paradise,
And
which was
Brian.
out at the time, and Richard Edson and John Lurie were in the film. So there was that, and also mentioned Ed Lockman, but Ed Lockman had basically spent his entire career as a standby cameraman. So when every European cameraman would come to New York for union purposes, if Sven Nykvist or any of these people were here, Ed was on the set. So he was like the greatest student of all the great cameramen. So he brought that European sensibility. But you gave him his first chance in this picture to be able to bring all that into the movie, and I think that was so exciting. It was my first job. So
It was the right cover. We were all eager, and it was just the right time. We kind of fed off each other's energy in a wonderful way. The film I feel most sentimental about is Smithereens. It's like your first kiss, your first love affair, Smithereens, because it was, you can't go back and become innocent again. That's what it is. It's wonderful when you do something and you just sort of stumble into it, and all your motivations are totally innocent and pure. You can't, and then you realize that you get more savvy about business and how things work, and you can't unlearn those things. So definitely Smithereens, definitely. And the other question was, what do I think happens to Ren at the end of Smithereens? I actually think she's a survivor. I think she'll, you know, the whole thing about her, she's always running after something. And I always thought of her as kind of like a scrappy little dog that you can kind of kick away, but she just comes back, and she's a survivor. So I am sure she is a survivor, and she will survive. And one thing I do want to mention, and when you'll see a picture of it in the book, but I think I was subconsciously aware of it, but I didn't analyze it too much. When you see the freeze frame, for those of you who know Smithereens, the end freeze frame, which is Susan Berman in the middle of a highway, kind of turning, and with this kind of confused look on her face, like you don't know what's going to happen next or how she's feeling about it, other than confusion, and the frame freezes. Take a look at the last freeze frame of the pilot of Sex and the City. It is some variation of that same exact shot, and both Ren and Sarah Jessica Parker are wearing a leopard, like an animal print clothing. I was surprised when I saw them, and when I started to think about, like, you know, it wasn't really until I started writing this book that I started pulling together some connections between things I've done. That was one connection I made, and I have to believe it was not totally unintentional. Well, people that I liked in real life or thought were interesting characters. Rockets is a great example. And he was around, you know, he was hanging
Everywhere.
around. Yeah. You know, if I could use them, I wanted to. You know, Susan Berman is making Mr. Right as well.
Exactly.
You know, it's fun to work with friends.
Yeah.
And in the same way that it's fun to work with the same editor a few times or the same actors. But again, you know, and I also like the mix of professional people, you know, actors who went to who studied acting, with just regular people who were just great characters